ended. Welcome. I want to pick up a little bit of where we left off in the session before, for those who were there. I kind of ended up becoming an advocate for LGBT aging issues just by the fact that I was an LGBT advocate with Garden State Equality and other things through my adult life, and somehow I retired.
Richard, you froze.
He was having trouble today. I'm going to jump in then, Rebecca. So I'm Reva Beck-Freeman, and are you back, Richard? Go ahead.
Sorry. Oh my gosh. I don't know if it's my computer or Comcast are the evil internet provider. So anyhow, I don't know where I disappeared.
You were talking about your involvement with Elders for Equality.
So just by the product of all of a sudden retiring and acknowledging my age, that I started to become very aware and active in the whole idea of what does it mean to be LGBT and entering into the retirement years and the aging years. And just my own experience of aging, I started to realize that LGBT seniors experience bias and prejudice from two directions, both in terms of the mainstream community, people who are prejudiced against LGBT people, but also the experience of having ageism in the LGBT community, and the twofold experience. What it leaves for us is a disconnect from both directions that our lives are immersed in. And as Reva talked about in the last session, we started by creating a space for people who are aging and gay, because they just don't feel welcome in all of their spaces. And one of the things I wanted to talk about in this session was, how do you make regular space, mainstream space, LGBT friendly? One of the things that happens for us in our experience is that when we enter into regular senior spaces, the language, the nonverbal things that happen make us feel unwelcome. And what I wanted to encourage people is to become aware of the basic definitions of LGBTQIA and all the other things. And I don't know if we really want to get into all of that today, but what ends up happening is people come into space. Things that are said very often make people feel unwelcome. If you do senior work and you use intake forms, sometimes intake forms expose your bias. Very often, if you're doing an intake form and you're asking couples about their lives, very often the intake form will include things like the male, who is the male, the head of the household, and the female or the wife. You know, the language in the form actually assumes a straight lifestyle. And the other thing that we're starting to discover more and more in the younger end, but not as, but it's throughout the whole society is the whole issue of the binary, that some people currently are in a process of transition and they don't necessarily identify as male, female. They're in their transition, they're identifying as non-binary. So I don't want to get into all the definitions of all cisgender and all these kind of things. Hopefully in creating space that you do that homework yourselves, but it's good work to do. Riva talked about at her at the Jewish Community Center, they do sensitivity training, and that kind of thing is really important in doing senior work, that we're sensitive. I think it's important to be sensitive both in terms of LGBT issues, but also it's important to be sensitive into issues of culture and race and all those other things. And that very often our groups look just like us because our lack of sensitivity to people who are different from us. And so that for me, that's a concern. But talking about LGBT seniors, one of the things that's true of us is that it's what studies have shown, that there's a certain trauma that people don't realize that has happened in the LGBT community. They talk about bias trauma that people experience who have experienced any kind of bias, prejudice, and that trauma continues on, and sometimes you feel stronger as you age. And for my generation of LGBT, we lived through the AIDS crisis, and there is a trauma that happened to LGBT baby boomers in the AIDS crisis that aging LGBT people carry with them into every experience of their lives going forward. For me, being part of the community in that point, literally half of all of our friends died of AIDS. We talk about the experience of COVID, where the numbers for seniors could be as high as 10%, which is unacceptable also. But can you imagine that 50% of all of your friends passed away because of a disease that wasn't being treated correctly, and a lot of just mistakes that had happened. And so the community that survived, but survived with scars. And so those senior LGBT people coming into your senior groups carry that with them. And it's subtle, that not necessarily talk about very often, but it's important to realize that it still exists. And the trauma of prejudice and the trauma of being denied jobs, being fired from jobs, all of those things are very much part of our experience. In New Jersey, we currently have non-discrimination laws, not always respected, but it's a safer place to be. But in other parts of the country, those traumas are still existing. So I guess, I don't know if there's anything else I want to say about that. I want to open it up to questions or comments or people's experience in this area. So anyone want to ask any questions or make any comments? Put a hand up, or just all. Miss Ruth, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi, I'm a member of a bunch of vision loss groups. I'm vision impaired myself, and I'm an ally in an LGBT blind group called Blind Pride International. And I think we're making some progress, but I found that with these regressive laws that are happening, like Don't Say Gay, some of the people in our larger vision loss groups feel empowered to say, and quite openly say, things that are really horrific to our members. And I wonder how would you respond? Because I think it's just adding fuel to respond at all. But I understand how you really want to. You just feel so mad at that.
For me, I think it's picking your fights. You know, there are appropriate places to do the fights in any kind of battle. But if it's internet chatter and all those kind of things, those fights aren't worth having.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes the fights where you can make change, whether it's legislative or change in terms of helping your circle of influence be changed, that's important. But I think it's very dangerous to engage, because it's exhausting, and I don't think it brings a lot of fruit to
I
engage
agree. Yeah,
those kind of things.
I agree. Yeah, I think it just gives them a platform to continue spewing, because now you've given them, almost talking to them as a peer, and they're really not. They're trying to deflate you or diminish you in some way. So I agree. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been in training with GLAD, who does advocacy information thing. And one of the things they talk about is spend your energy helping to educate the people who are capable of hearing it. And don't waste your time on the people who aren't ready to hear it. So very often, like the people in this group right now, you may not know everything about these issues, but you're here to learn. And that's where the energy is important to spend on, with people who are listening and ready to hear the word, and not waste time on, the internet trolls. And that's one of the things that GLAD talks about is the whole idea of, you have your allies, you have your people who are open to hear, and then you have the closed-minded. And their point is, don't waste any time on the closed-minded, because there's so many people who are ready to hear information, and it's just about spreading it, which is why Reva and I talked about doing these talks today, because it's about the people who show up in these kind of environments are people who are ready to move to the next step of information. Anyone
Thank you.
else?
I guess I wanted to speak. I run the group on senior LGBTQ in Northern New Jersey.
Mhm.
And we find that we're getting mostly younger people. When I say younger, I mean 60s and 70s. Do you get any people older than that? And if you do, how are you reaching them?
That's more of a Reva question. Specifically, Elders for Equality is part of Garden State Equality, and it's just a networking, and it hasn't been very active. COVID really put a damper in our progress with it. But doing specific work with a group showing up, that's what Reva and I have been working with in Cherry Hill, and the group does trend maybe on that younger end, like you say, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I think you hit a certain point beyond that where it becomes really hard for people to get out. I don't know if what Reva thinks in that process. So
Well, let me jump in, Richard, then.
Yeah.
I mean, because I work for a social service agency, Jewish Family and Children's Service, that serves older adults in their homes and, volunteer services and things like that. We can identify some people that way, and word of mouth. But those of you who were in the last group when I talked about LGBT aging with pride, the group that I created and facilitate that Richard is part of, um, the initial guide was, he's now 95 years old. Um,
Does he come in person or do you do Zoom with him?
he did until June, and I'm heartbroken. He's now in long-term care. He had a sort of a back surgery, and it just set him back. And at 95, he's sort of like the queen, you know. It just, so he's alive. I'm going to see him tomorrow. But yeah, but you know, word of mouth, and we do have people in their 80s in the group. You know, but because we meet in person, it's more active people. Some of the older ones did not come on Zoom, actually. The 95-year-old did. He was very competent. But
You know, that's interesting because we tend to get we run two groups, one in person and one on Zoom. And the only one that's gotten a few older 80 has been the Zoom version.
because transportation
Right.
can be a problem.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think I mean, we're only 5 years into our group, and I think there's an evolution that happens. And as we progress, I think there may be some conversation. The group in Philadelphia, COVID kind of moved them to Zoom, and now they do a hybrid. So now they're meeting weekly, but they're meeting 3 in person, 3 Tuesdays a month, and the 4th Tuesday of the month they do Zoom. And so that, I think COVID has kind of moved us into a process of doing, I mean, this kind of meeting would have been held in person 5 years ago. You know, that things have changed over time, but I think this whole new world is, we're all still adapting. So, and I think as our group ages, we may see, I mean, one of the things that's happening with our 95-year-old person who was part of the group and active in the group, and as he's now becoming unable to come, the people in the group still feel connection and are sending him letters and cards that becomes, you know, a continuing outreach to people who are definitely, I mean, this gentleman was in a partnership and marriage for 60 years. And when the partner dies and they have no children, that's the life of the LGBT senior. There's straight people who also have the same experience, but for LGBT seniors in my generation, the possibility of having children was not a possibility unless you were previously married. And so that my generation, myself included, I'm single with no children, and that there's a sense where family doesn't exist. And these kind of outreaches and welcoming experiences is key to people who have no significant family. It's one of the reasons I've become a strong advocate in this area, because it's the idea of connection. One of the things that Riva and I have worked on is creating intergenerational. Sage does it a little bit, but the thing that we discover from our group and the comments that people make is they have a story to tell. LGBT seniors have incredible stories to tell, and no one wants to hear them. And so that's probably true of aging people in general, but especially LGBT people have these incredible stories. And that's one of the things that just blows Riva away a lot of times, is these people come in and tell these stories of, you know, of advocacy and love, you know, lost loves and all these kind of things. They have these stories to tell, and when we do intergenerational work in small parts so far, what we experience is that the young generation who comes and hears these stories all of a sudden has a wake-up experience and says, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that the you know, basically for a lot of young folks, it's like they know the Stonewall story, and very often they don't know the truth of it. And the experience they're in now, and they don't know this big, wide experience that happened between Stonewall and marriage equality, that there was a whole awful lot of history that happened in our life experience that is important to tell. And so one of the things we want to, Reeve and I have talked about often is to do more intergenerational conversations. Because one, the seniors, whether they have an effect on younger folks, what's really important, the seniors have a need to tell their stories, because in telling your story, it gives you value. And one of the things I hear from the people in our group is sometimes they just feel undervalued. They feel thrown away. And that's true of a lot of people who are aging. They feel kind of tossed aside. But especially LGBT folks kind of feel like, especially when you don't have children to tell your stories to or bore your grandchildren with, that it's important to find LGBT younger folks to step up and become the grandchildren of this generation. Any other comments or questions? Julie.
Hi, thank you. I run a senior program for a social service agency in Middlesex County, and I've taken many courses. I identify as, I'm cisgender, female, identify as lesbian. And the one thing that was noted that, you know, older people in the early part of their lives, they were not out, right? They couldn't be out. And then we came to this middle ground where it started to be okay to be openly gay, and things, you know, kind of opened up for us and all. And then they start aging and going into long-term care facilities, and they go back in the closet because there's no space for them in those places, right? So I was wondering if there was any advocacy that was going on from your end to go to these places to try to make those spaces for seniors.
I have 1 minute, so I'm going to be really quick. Garden State Equality has worked towards passing laws in New Jersey towards making long care facilities accountable to be LGBT competent. And friendly is a hope, but competent is part of the law. So the short answer is that there are state laws which now require long care facilities in New Jersey to be competent in LGBT issues and specific criteria of what they're required to do. So I think our time's up. So thank you all. And if you have any questions, you can reach out and contact us through the Age Friendly